Okay, guilt and shame. A cycle of guilt and shame comes from repressed doubts, social pressure, and failure to meet impossible standards.
Yeah, that's pretty much constant. But
In what way?
first, there's always a feeling that, especially if you're actually in activism, there's always a feeling that you're not doing enough. There's that feeling of guilt in social justice, especially because they're identitarian. I think a lot of people feel guilt over their own privilege, for example, or what they are told is their privilege. So that's one part of that. But I saw the words repressed doubts, which obviously are a really big thing in the trans community. And so there's a lot of people who are doubting it. It's really easy to find doubts on any subreddit, any forum. There's people who are talking about it all the time. And almost all of them are told that it's not that you're not trans, it's internalized transphobia. So that's how doubts get reframed, is that it's your mind being oppressive to yourself, basically. You're being transphobic to yourself. You're saying that trans has to be one way. You're preventing yourself from expressing yourself authentically. You're afraid because trans people aren't accepted in society. If you have the thought at any point in time, what if I'm not trans? What if I'm just making this all up in my head? And I did have that thought. And the way that I got through that was just pushing that aside. So yeah, that would be another, maybe not guilt. Maybe it's not even really guilt or shame, but it is a way of removing the possibility of having guilt later on if you detransitioned, I guess. So related in that way.
In defining these things a little bit better, guilt would be feeling bad about yourself for not conforming to the beliefs or actions expected of you. And shame would be the feeling of badness that you get from the judgments of others when they see that you have not conformed. And so what you're talking about, and just in terms of if you start to question any of the dogma, then you're already given the way you're supposed to respond to those internal doubts, which could be a source of guilt, which is to silence them, to squash them, to reframe them as self-hatred. And so then you can continue in that mode of belief. What about public shaming? People will say that cancel culture itself is a form of shaming that's meant to police thought and police speech. And that seems to be a very strong component of the trans activist community in particular. Would you agree with that? And how would you explain this?
Yeah, that is a big part of it, is basically the possibility of being canceled, which is a public shaming. So that does make shame a really big part of it. And really, there's a lot of secondhand shame seeing other people being canceled as well. So, yeah.
Is that form of social policing reserved for outsiders, or would you find that it's applied equally no matter where you are, and the thing that reigns supreme is really just the right thoughts and the right language has to be used whether you're inside or outside?
I think anyone, and it's not necessarily the people inside that have to be doing it. And it's become very strange in a lot of these identitarian type spaces because, and a lot of people have pointed this out recently, especially, is that a lot of the people that are proselytizing now on behalf of trans people are not trans themselves. So it's a lot of people who just think that they're doing the right thing, so they're going to jump in and they're going to do the punishing on behalf of the marginalized group that shouldn't have to do it, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with that. It's odd because there's a way to push back against that, which in the race domain, people will say, we don't need white saviors. And doing that implies that there's something weak or incompetent about the group that you're defending, that you think you need to come in and save them. Does that exist also in the domain of gender?
They can't really make up their mind with that. On one part, it's cis people, you need to step up and protect your trans siblings. And then on the other hand, basically it's you need to center trans voices and you need to uplift trans voices. And why are you trying to take the wheel from us, kind of thing. So it is like a little bit of both, where it's you need to be doing more, but you're not doing enough. You're not doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So,
no, we're going to cover the double bind, which that sounds like a good example of in the future. But the other thing is it's really useful because it allows you to criticize or problematize somebody if it serves the greater good, no matter what they do. And the fact that's happening in social media means that you're using public shame as a way to compel compliance, which very much fits into what we're assessing right here. So you mentioned that it does play a role in repressing doubts, social pressure, that guilt and shame, and realizing that it can be taken on and acted on by people who aren't even in the community, I think is part of the reason that we're silencing dissent and not seeing people like that. You would have nobody give a like to posts about your own experience as a detransitioner, is the fear of the consequences that go along with having wrongthink, and the shame involved with the community judgment and actions based on that is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
So what do you think? How do you score it?
I think it's severe, to be honest.
All right. Okay, you've mentioned this one before, and so I'm interested in your take on it. Love bombing. Friendliness, flattery, praise, and affection are used to entice participation and attendance for potential recruits and retain members who might be showing less enthusiasm or thinking of leaving. Members must project an image of happiness for the sake of the group.
Yeah. So a lot of people get that right when they come out. There's a lot of celebration of the trans identity. And I think it also gets reinforced with every single step you take. And I think that's why I didn't mention this earlier, but I've said several times now that there is that sort of expected pathway that people are taking. And I think that's how that it's expected, because as soon as they announce, oh, I'm going to go on hormones, then again, there's another celebration. I'm going to have top surgery. There's another celebration. Each time there's a lot of you're just getting the positive feedback over and over. So they might say there's no one way to be trans, but if there's only one way in which you're getting positive feedback every single step of the way, that's how it's happening. Yeah.
And if by contrast, if you were to come out and then say, I've decided that hormones and surgery are not for me, and I'm happy with who I am as a trans person without those things, would there be the same level of celebration?
I'm not sure. I think they're like within, if you said that on Facebook or something, I'm sure like all of the people that were friends with them and family with them would be totally down with it. They'd be totally fine with it. It'd be something that they might even celebrate as like you're taking your own path sort of thing. But I feel like it wouldn't be as widespread like amongst the community.
You've mentioned that there are factions that exist. What is a trans medicalist, and how would they receive something like that?
Yeah, transmedicalism is people who believe that trans it's a medical condition, essentially. And I do feel like they're closer to the truth. So they do believe it's a medical condition, and if you have the medical condition, then you're supposed to get the treatment for it. They don't necessarily think that you have to medically transition, but they don't believe transgender is simply a gender identity that differs from your sex. They believe transgender is something they were born with. It's a medical condition that they were born with, and that needs treatment. And the mainstream feeling of trans lately is a lot more concentrating on expression and like personal truth rather than really like evidence-based medicine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so on love bombing, then, we talked about the vulnerabilities that exist in particularly the groups that tend to be moving in this direction. Young women in particular, there seems to be a strong uptick in young women who are identifying as trans and pursuing medical or surgical intervention. And people have tried to draw parallels between other things that have a social contagion element, if they want to look at it through that lens, such as cutting or anorexia, and just say there's something about the development of young women at that particular stage that make them particularly vulnerable to this. But with that vulnerability of all of the issues that go along there, there's this thing that can provide a great deal of euphoria and sense of acceptance, which is this love bombing, where people are just giving you so much positive affirmation that may feed your ego. It may give you a different narrative than the idea that you're an outsider and no one understands you, because now you have this whole community of people that understand you. Did love bombing play a big role in your own journey?
I am not sure if it really did for me personally. And maybe it was because I transitioned before it was, I don't want to say the cool thing, but it was before it became the social contagion that it became in 2014-ish. I transitioned in 2010. So I was a few years early, but it was very big on Tumblr at that time as well. And I don't really know, I can't think of any instances where it was really, love bombing was really a thing. In fact, I got more love bombed when I detransitioned, which people will point that out. They'll be like, oh, detransitioners are getting love bombed by the gender critical movement. And yes, they are. Assessments like this, is it culty? That's how we figure out whether it's a good love bombing or a bad love bombing. And I don't think it's necessarily from the gender critical side. It's not necessarily always good, but I think people just need to keep in mind that not everybody is interested in them as a person. Sometimes they're just interested in your story. But yeah, I don't think it was necessarily a thing that I received too much of. Although I do think I got more positive feedback on my selfies when I was still trans, even though I think I look better now. But yeah.
The point that you bring up in terms of how do you distinguish love bombing from authentic connection and authentic positive feedback, which everybody justifiably may experience in their life and find positive results from. And that point that you made in terms of people being interested in you as a person versus you as simply an avatar for your identity or your place in an ideology is a really important distinguishing factor between the two. I was on a podcast recently where we were discussing this issue of love bombing, and that's the critical distinction. If people are seeing you for who you are and accepting of your differences from them in terms of the way that you think about things or your answer to the questions of society, then that's more of an authentic connection and what could be the start of a real friendship versus something that is contingent upon you believing the same things, participating in the community. And as soon as you show any deviation from that, then they're going to withdraw that positive affirmation. Then that becomes a red flag that this may be love bombing that's more ideologically driven rather than an authentic positive connection with another human being. People will talk about at times when they are starting to express doubts first. That may be a moment where the group starts to shower them with additional praise to try to entice them to squelch their doubts and remain among the faithful in religious contexts. Does that exist, or did you observe anything like that? Is it a secondary love bombing sort of thing?
I can't think of very many examples, but what it does remind me of is after detransitioning, sometimes I will, and I've seen other detransitioners as well, encounter people who are trying to bring us back in very clearly. They'll say, in fact, they will use the fact that the people that we associate with now might only care about our stories and not really care about us. So they'll say things like, oh, these TERFs don't actually care about you. They only want to weaponize your narrative, and then suggest that we left the beautiful utopia where we would always be loved, and then we are still loved. We just need to come back into the fold, sort of thing. So that does exist. I don't know if it's necessarily love bombing, but that does happen. Yeah.
It definitely sounds like it's in the category. What about the sense that whatever you're feeling, you need to project that your participation in the group is the best thing ever and that you have a happy life? Your problems have been positively addressed by your participation in the group. And it's like this facade of fake positivity that you have to project in order to maintain the illusion that the group is positive and healthy and good for people. Did that play a role in your participation?
I think so. Yeah. I think I said earlier that I would have said it was life-saving and that I needed to do it and etc., which isn't really, I don't think is true. What that reminds me of though is that like I've mentioned I was in a really controlling relationship, and I felt obligated to do things like that where I would basically talk about how awesome my relationship was or how awesome my partner was, even though we were having trouble behind the scenes. And it was a way of it's really cognitive dissonance, trying to soothe it, just knowing that I thought it was bad. But if I just keep telling people that it was good, then maybe I was going to start to believe it, sort of thing. But yeah, no, I did do that throughout my transition, where in looking back on it at it now, I can see that it didn't help me in probably any way at all. Like the only way you could say it quote unquote helped me was that it taught me what the wrong thing to do was. But yeah.
I think knowing that's how you see it and reflect on it in your life, it's got to be difficult to have people then accusing you of finding positivity in the people who are willing to show you that positivity, choosing a different path, as just you falling for some other brainwashing scheme or scam is difficult.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that people realize in the religious context or the political context is all the flattery and all the praise is really just for doing the things that are expected of the group. And it's all fake. And so one of the things that manifests the love bombing is that when you do decide to go your own way, suddenly all those friends that you had, all the positive affirmation that you had, disappears in a puff of smoke. Whereas if you have a friend who's in like a knitting club and then they move to the crochet club, actually, I shouldn't use that example. I hear that those people are very wed to their particular hobby, but something like that, where it's like some non-controversial thing, like you would still show up for your friends, still support them in their achievements that they see as positive from their perspective. But that degree of fakeness to the flattery and praise is an element of why it's considered love bombing and not real. Did you find your friends disappear or their positive influence disappear?
Yeah, no, I did. Some of them unfriended me immediately. Not very many. I think only a few. And then the rest, there were a couple people I had actual confrontations with, specifically when I started criticizing the medicalization aspect. Because that really is my biggest criticism. And then there were a few people that I'm still technically friends with, in that we're still connected on social media, but we almost never interact with each other. So it does feel like a lot of that went away. And as I said before, I post things about detransition where literally no one likes it, no one comments, no one says anything. So yeah, no, it did go away.
Okay, well, on this metric of love bombing, how would you rate your experience?
For me, moderate.
Okay, so this is related to stuff we talked about in the past. Social pressure. Social acceptance and rejections are used as a reward and punishment. A member becomes driven with a desire to conform.
Yeah, it's pretty severe.
Yeah, I think this falls under some of the category when we talked about guilt and shame. A lot of that is mediated by social pressure.
Yeah.
You took some steps that are a level beyond in terms of surgery and medication than what many people will have taken on that journey. Did social pressure play a role in deciding to take those steps? And how strong was that in the decision?
I think it did. I'm trying to think about why I chose each of my surgeries. And every time I think about the only reasons I had, they seem such like inadequate reasons for having surgery. Like, for example, one of the big driving factors behind the mastectomy was that I wanted to be able to swim with my shirt off. And just thinking back on that now, just how it just seems like a very small thing to have such a big surgery over. It was a young person, it was a youth's decision, basically. I was 23 when I made the decision. It's a childish decision in hindsight.
If we drill down on that particular point, just to understand how an idea like that might become a larger than life idea in the mind of a young person, where would you have first encountered the idea that that was an important thing that might be a part of the calculation to get surgery?
I think part of it was that I went to a summer, I guess it was a camp. Yeah, it was like a summer camp thing with other people. And that is how like the pressure came into it. The social pressure was that I was around all of these mostly men, mostly guys, young guys that all had their shirts off. And there was me who had to wear a t-shirt in the water. So I think that's sort of where it came from, was that it was, again, that desire to be like everyone else and to belong and to not have to stand out. That's another sort of contradiction that I experienced throughout transitioning, was that there was this simultaneously I wanted to fit in and belong and be like everyone else. And at the exact same time, knowing that if I was transitioning, I was always going to be different. And the reason I was transitioning is because I was already different and I had never fit in anywhere in my life. And then later on down the road, when I started dyeing my hair, I think that was another sort of thing where I was like, I'm different from everyone and I'm okay with that. And yeah, so it was a little bit of both. But yeah, I don't know.
All right.
Yeah.
Social pressure then. How do we want to score it?
See, it's high, the social pressure. All of those other aspects that talk about social pressure, I think it's severe.